The static crackled through Marcus Riley's radio like the dying breath of civilization itself, and for a moment he thought he heard something impossible, a human voice cutting through the white noise that had dominated the airwaves for 3 long years. Marcus pressed the device closer to his ear, his weathered fingers trembling as he adjusted the frequency dial in the dim light of the abandoned subway tunnel that had become his sanctuary. Around him, the 17 survivors of his group continued their evening routines, unaware that their leader might have just intercepted the first sign of organized human life since the Great Collapse. Rebecca Martinez looked up from where she was teaching her 8-year-old daughter Emma basic first aid, her dark eyes questioning the sudden tension in Marcus's shoulders. The radio hissed again, and this time the words came through crystal clear. "This is Dr. James Patterson broadcasting from Research Station Alpha 7. If anyone can hear this transmission, we have successfully developed a countermeasure. Repeat, we have a countermeasure. Please respond on frequency 147.3. We are located 60 miles north of the ruins of Chicago. We can help you." The words hung in the stale air like a prayer answered, and Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs as the full implications sank in. Dr. Patterson's voice continued with coordinates and a brief explanation that sent shockwaves through Marcus's understanding of their situation. The scientist claimed that his team had not only survived the zombie plague that had reduced humanity to scattered bands of scavengers and fighters, but had actually found a way to reverse the infection. The transmission spoke of a serum that could restore cognitive function to the infected, effectively bringing the dead back to a semblance of life without the murderous hunger that had defined them for so long. Marcus's mind raced as he considered the possibilities and the dangers. His group had survived this long by staying hidden, by moving carefully through the shadows of a world overrun by the shambling hordes that had once been their neighbors, friends, and family. They had learned to read the patterns of the infected, to navigate around the massive herds that migrated through the urban landscape like deadly storms. But hope, real hope, had been a luxury they couldn't afford until now. The subway tunnel that sheltered them had been their home for 8 months, ever since they'd been forced to abandon their previous hideout when a swarm of nearly 200 infected had discovered their location. The tunnel provided multiple escape routes and had proven defensible, but it was no place to build a future. Rebecca approached him quietly, her medical training allowing her to read the signs of stress and excitement warring across his features. She had been a nurse before the world ended, and her skills had kept more than one member of their group alive when antibiotics and proper medical equipment were nothing but memories. Her daughter Emma clung to her side, having learned through hard experience that adult conversations often meant danger or difficult decisions ahead. Tommy Rodriguez, their best scout and former Marine, emerged from the tunnel's depths where he'd been checking their perimeter sensors. At 26, he was the youngest adult in their group, but his military training and natural instincts had saved them countless times. His approach was silent, a habit developed through necessity in a world where unnecessary noise could mean death. The rest of their group began to gather as word spread through subtle gestures and whispered conversations. There was Janet Foster, a retired teacher who had become their unofficial historian and keeper of pre-plague knowledge. David Kim, an engineer whose technical expertise had helped them maintain their equipment and create defensive measures. Maria Santos with her twin boys Carlos and Diego, ages 12 and 14, who had adapted to this harsh new world with the resilience that only children seem to possess. Old Pete Morrison, a Vietnam veteran whose combat experience and steady nerves had proven invaluable. Lisa Chin, barely 18 but already a capable fighter and forager, and several others who had found their way to Marcus's group through tragedy, loss, and the simple human need for connection and protection. As Marcus looked around at these faces that had become family through shared hardship and mutual dependence, he realized that Dr. Patterson's transmission represented more than just hope for survival. It represented the possibility of reclaiming their humanity, of building something better from the ashes of the old world. But the journey to Research Station Alpha 7 would take them through some of the most dangerous territory they had ever attempted to cross, including the infested remains of 3 major cities and the mysterious phenomenon that survivors had dubbed the dead zones, where even the infected seemed to avoid traveling. Marcus stood before his makeshift family in the flickering light of their battery-powered lanterns, the radio still clutched in his weathered hands as he prepared to share news that could either save them all or lead them to their deaths. The silence in the tunnel was absolute except for the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness beyond their camp, and he could feel the weight of 17 pairs of eyes studying his face for clues about what had caused his sudden tension. When he finally spoke, his voice carried both the authority of leadership and the vulnerability of hope long suppressed, explaining Dr. Patterson's transmission word for word while watching their expressions shift from skepticism to amazement to fear. Rebecca Martinez was the first to respond, her medical training making her naturally cautious about claims that seemed too good to be true, and she voiced what many of them were thinking when she pointed out that in 3 years of silence, this single transmission could easily be a trap set by hostile survivors looking to lure desperate groups into ambushes. Her daughter Emma pressed closer to her mother's side, sensing the gravity of the adult conversation even if she couldn't fully understand the implications, while Tommy Rodriguez stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone who had spent years making life-or-death decisions under pressure. Tommy argued that they couldn't afford to ignore this opportunity, that their current existence was merely survival without any real future, and that if there was even a chance that Dr. Patterson's claims were legitimate, they owed it to themselves and to humanity to investigate. David Kim, ever the engineer, raised practical concerns about the journey itself, spreading out a hand-drawn map on their makeshift table and tracing the route north while highlighting the numerous dangers they would face, from infected hordes to hostile survivor settlements to the mysterious dead zones that even the most experienced scavengers avoided. Old Pete Morrison, whose combat experience in Vietnam had taught him about calculated risks, surprised everyone by siding with Tommy, explaining that their current position was becoming increasingly untenable as infected migration patterns were slowly herding more undead toward their area. Janet Foster, their teacher and keeper of knowledge, reminded them that throughout history, the greatest advances had come from people willing to take extraordinary risks in desperate times, while Maria Santos clutched her twin boys closer and voiced her fear that such a journey would be suicide for the children in their group. The debate continued for hours, with voices rising and falling in the dim tunnel as different factions emerged around various proposals and concerns. Lisa Chin, despite her youth, made a compelling argument that they needed to think beyond mere survival and consider what kind of world they wanted to rebuild, while several of the other adults worried that leaving their secure hideout was tantamount to gambling with lives they had fought so hard to preserve. Marcus listened to every voice, weighing not just their words but the fear and hope that drove them, understanding that whatever decision they made would fundamentally change their group's dynamic and possibly determine their fate. Rebecca proposed a compromise that initially seemed to satisfy no one but gradually gained support as they discussed its merits. Instead of moving the entire group, they would send a small advance team to verify the transmission's authenticity and assess the dangers of the route. Tommy immediately volunteered to lead such a mission, his military experience making him the obvious choice for reconnaissance, while David's technical skills would be essential for maintaining communication and navigation equipment. The discussion then shifted to the composition of this advanced team, with heated arguments about who should go and who should stay to protect the others, particularly the children who represented their only hope for a future generation. Marcus realized that he would have to make the ultimate leadership decision about whether to risk everything on Dr. Patterson's promise or continue their slow decline in the relative safety of the tunnel, and the weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. As the night wore on and their debates grew more intense, the group gradually came to understand that this decision would define not just their immediate future but their very identity as survivors in a world that had already taken everything from them once before. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than Marcus had expected, but the result was clear. They would send the advance team north, keeping the main group together while 3 volunteers risked everything to determine whether Dr. Patterson's research station represented salvation or simply another false hope in a world that had already delivered too many crushing disappointments. As the meeting broke up and people returned to their sleeping areas, Marcus caught Rebecca's eye and saw his own mixture of terror and anticipation reflected there, knowing that by morning they would begin preparations for a journey that could either restore humanity's future or destroy the last remnants of their carefully built sanctuary. The pre-dawn darkness felt heavier than usual as Marcus, Tommy, and David made their final preparations for the journey that would either validate their hopes or confirm their worst fears about the outside world. Rebecca had insisted on checking their medical supplies one final time, her hands lingering on Marcus's shoulders as she adjusted his pack straps with the careful attention of someone who might be saying goodbye forever. The rest of the group maintained a respectful distance, understanding that this moment required both privacy and solemnity, though Emma had broken away from her mother long enough to press a small hand-drawn picture into Tommy's jacket pocket, a crude but heartfelt illustration of three stick figures standing triumphantly over a group of fallen zombies. The tunnel that had sheltered them for so long now felt like a tomb they were eager to escape, and as the three men shouldered their packs and checked their weapons one final time, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The first hours of their journey took them through familiar territory, the abandoned subway system that connected to other tunnels and maintenance corridors they had mapped extensively during their months of hiding, but as they emerged into the gray morning light at the system's northern terminus, they entered a landscape that had changed dramatically since their last reconnaissance mission 6 months earlier. The infected had clearly been active in this area, with fresh signs of their passage visible in the form of trampled vegetation, scattered bones, and the distinctive smell of decay that seemed to linger in places where large groups of undead had recently gathered. Tommy took point with the practiced efficiency of his military training, using hand signals to communicate potential threats and route changes while David monitored their radio equipment and GPS coordinates with the focused attention of an engineer who understood that a single navigation error could mean the difference between life and death. By midday, they encountered their first disturbing evidence that the infected were exhibiting behavior patterns unlike anything they had observed during the previous 3 years of the outbreak. A group of nearly 30 zombies stood motionless in a perfect circle around an abandoned shopping center, their heads tilted at identical angles as if listening to something the living men couldn't hear, and their coordination was so precise that it seemed almost ritualistic rather than the random clustering they had grown accustomed to seeing. David whispered urgent observations into his notebook while Tommy photographed the scene with a small digital camera they had salvaged specifically for intelligence gathering, both men acutely aware that this new behavior could represent either an evolution in the infection or evidence that Dr. Patterson's research had already begun affecting the infected population in ways they didn't understand. Their radio crackled to life around noon with transmissions from other survivor groups who had apparently heard Dr. Patterson's broadcast and were also making their way toward the coordinates he had provided. And Marcus found himself torn between relief at discovering they weren't the only ones brave enough to investigate and concern about the potential complications of multiple groups converging on the same destination. The first contact came from a group calling themselves the Phoenix Coalition, led by a woman named Captain Sarah Williams who identified herself as former military police and claimed to have 43 survivors under her command, including several children and elderly individuals who would slow their progress but added legitimacy to their claim of being genuine refugees rather than raiders or bandits. The second transmission was more troubling, originating from a man who called himself Colonel Jake Morrison and spoke with the clipped authority of someone accustomed to giving orders, demanding information about other groups' locations and resources in a way that made Tommy's military instincts flare with warning signals. Marcus made the decision to maintain radio silence with Morrison's group while establishing cautious communication protocols with Captain Williams, agreeing to share general route information and potential hazard warnings while keeping their exact position and capabilities confidential until they could assess the trustworthiness of these other survivors. The afternoon brought their first direct encounter with another group when they discovered 5 people resting in an abandoned gas station. A family unit consisting of parents Michael and Jennifer Patterson with their teenage son Lucas and 2 other adults they had picked up during their journey from the ruins of Detroit. The coincidence of the family name immediately raised suspicions, but Michael Patterson quickly explained that Dr. James Patterson was his older brother, and that the family had been traveling toward the research station for 2 weeks after receiving a private radio message that preceded the general broadcast by several days. This revelation added new urgency to their mission while raising uncomfortable questions about why Dr. Patterson had contacted some survivors privately before making his general announcement, and whether there were aspects of his research that he hadn't shared in his public transmission. The boundary of the dead zone appeared without warning as Marcus, Tommy, and David crested a hill overlooking what had once been the thriving suburb of Millbrook, but the silence that greeted them was unlike anything they had experienced in 3 years of navigating the post-apocalyptic landscape. Where they should have encountered the usual scattered groups of infected wandering aimlessly through the streets, instead they found an eerie emptiness that made their skin crawl with an instinctive sense of wrongness, as if they had stumbled into a place where the normal rules of their dangerous world no longer applied. Tommy raised his binoculars and scanned the abandoned houses and overgrown lawns below, searching for any sign of movement or threat, but the suburban streets remained stubbornly devoid of the shambling figures that had become such a constant presence in their daily survival calculations. David checked his radiation detector and other scientific instruments, confirming that whatever was causing this phenomenon wasn't related to nuclear contamination or obvious environmental hazards, while Marcus studied their hand-drawn maps and tried to reconcile the reports they had heard about dead zones with the inexplicable tranquility spread out before them. Michael Patterson had warned them about these areas during their brief conversation at the gas station, explaining that his brother Dr. James Patterson had mentioned them in their private communications as regions where the infected seemed to avoid traveling, but none of the second-hand descriptions had prepared them for the profound sense of unease that settled over the three men as they began their descent into the zone. The first infected person they encountered changed everything they thought they understood about the plague that had destroyed civilization, because instead of the mindless aggression and relentless hunger they expected, they found a middle-aged woman sitting peacefully on her front porch, her movements slow but deliberate as she tended to a small garden that showed clear signs of careful cultivation and planning. Tommy instinctively reached for his weapon before Marcus grabbed his arm, both men staring in disbelief as the woman looked up at them with eyes that held unmistakable intelligence and recognition, her face bearing the telltale pallor and visible veins of infection but none of the savage hostility that had defined every other encounter with the undead they had ever experienced. The woman spoke in a voice that was hoarse and strained but undeniably human, introducing herself as Elizabeth Wright and explaining that she had been a researcher with the Centers for Disease Control before the outbreak, and that she had been studying the unusual properties of this dead zone for nearly 18 months since discovering that some infected individuals were spontaneously recovering aspects of their cognitive function. Dr. Wright invited them into her house with the casual hospitality of someone entertaining normal guests rather than armed survivors in a zombie apocalypse, and as they followed her through rooms that were clean, organized, and decorated with fresh flowers, Marcus felt his understanding of reality shifting in ways that left him struggling to process what he was witnessing. Elizabeth explained that approximately 30% of infected individuals who entered this particular dead zone began showing signs of recovered memory, emotional regulation, and complex reasoning within weeks of arrival, though they retained the physical changes associated with the infection and still required a diet that included human tissue to maintain their health and cognitive function. She had been documenting this phenomenon meticulously, conducting research with limited equipment salvaged from nearby medical facilities, and had identified several other infected individuals in the area who were experiencing similar recovery patterns, forming a small community of recovered zombies who were trying to understand their condition and find ways to help others. The implications of Elizabeth's research hit the three men like a physical blow, because if infected individuals could recover naturally in certain locations, it suggested that Dr. James Patterson's serum might not be the only hope for humanity's future, and it raised profound questions about what was causing these recovery zones and whether the effect could be replicated elsewhere. David immediately began taking detailed notes and asking technical questions about Elizabeth's methodology and findings, while Tommy remained visibly uncomfortable with the idea of trusting someone who was technically still infected, regardless of how normal she appeared to be behaving. Elizabeth offered to guide them through the dead zone and introduce them to other recovered infected individuals, explaining that her community had established peaceful contact with several survivor groups and was actively working to document the recovery process in hopes of eventually sharing their findings with other researchers like Dr. Patterson. As evening approached and they prepared to spend their first night in the company of recovered zombies, Marcus realized that their mission had become far more complex than simply verifying Dr. Patterson's claims, because they had stumbled upon evidence that the path to humanity's second chance might involve learning to coexist with the infected rather than simply curing or destroying them. Research Station Alpha 7 materialized through the morning mist like a fortress of science and hope, its concrete walls and sophisticated antenna arrays standing defiantly against the backdrop of a world that had seemingly forgotten such ambitious human achievements. But as Marcus, Tommy, David, and their new ally Elizabeth Wright approached the facility's outer perimeter, the absence of any visible security or welcoming committee sent warning signals racing through their battle-hardened instincts. The station's main gate hung open at an unnatural angle, its electronic locks clearly disabled by force rather than proper procedure, and the ground around the entrance bore the unmistakable signs of recent combat, scattered shell casings, dark stains that could only be blood, and the acrid smell of gunpowder that still lingered in the air despite the passage of several days since whatever violence had occurred here. Tommy moved into full reconnaissance mode, his military training taking over as he signaled for the others to take cover behind an abandoned vehicle while he advanced alone to assess the immediate threats, his rifle ready and his eyes scanning every shadow and potential ambush point with the methodical precision of someone who had survived too many dangerous situations to take anything for granted. Elizabeth remained eerily calm despite the obvious signs of trouble, her recovered zombie physiology giving her enhanced senses that allowed her to detect scents and sounds that the living humans couldn't perceive, and she whispered urgent warnings about the presence of both infected and human combatants somewhere within the complex's maze of buildings and laboratories. The interior of Research Station Alpha 7 told a story of scientific achievement turned into a battlefield, with sophisticated equipment destroyed or hastily abandoned, research notes scattered across blood-stained floors, and the unmistakable evidence that whoever had been working here had been forced to defend their discoveries against attackers who had shown no mercy in their assault. David's engineering background allowed him to piece together the facility's original purpose from the damaged equipment and surviving documentation, revealing that Dr. Patterson's team had indeed been conducting advanced research on zombie reversal treatments, but the scale and complexity of their work suggested experiments that went far beyond the simple serum described in his radio broadcasts. They found Dr. James Patterson himself in what had once been the main laboratory, a man in his 60s whose gaunt appearance and haunted eyes spoke of weeks spent hiding in the ruins of his life's work, and when he emerged from behind an overturned research table with his hands raised in surrender, his first words revealed the terrible truth that his radio transmissions had been sent under duress by captors who had been using him as bait to lure survivor groups into their trap. Dr. Patterson explained through tears of exhaustion and shame that his serum did indeed work to restore cognitive function to infected individuals, but the process required massive amounts of adrenaline and other hormones that could only be harvested from living humans under extreme stress, making each dose of his cure dependent on the torture and eventual death of immune survivors who possessed the specific biological markers necessary for serum production. The doctor's confession was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles, and Colonel Harrison Mills arrived with a convoy of heavily armed soldiers whose military bearing and professional equipment marked them as remnants of some organized authority that had survived the collapse of civilization by abandoning any pretense of protecting civilian populations. Colonel Mills was a tall, imposing man whose steel-gray eyes and precisely groomed appearance projected an aura of absolute control, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question as he explained that his organization had been tracking immune survivors across the continent for the specific purpose of harvesting the biological materials necessary to mass-produce Dr. Patterson's serum. The colonel's soldiers moved with practiced efficiency to surround Marcus and his companions, their weapons trained with professional precision, while Mills explained his vision of rebuilding civilization through the systematic exploitation of immune individuals, arguing that the sacrifice of a few hundred survivors was a small price to pay for returning millions of infected to productive human society. Elizabeth's presence complicated the colonel's plans in ways that were immediately obvious, because her status as a naturally recovered infected individual represented a potential alternative to his harvesting operation. But Mills dismissed her condition as an isolated anomaly that couldn't be replicated on the scale necessary to address the global crisis. The standoff that developed in the ruins of the research station crystallized the fundamental choice facing humanity's survivors: whether to pursue Dr. Patterson's cure at the cost of systematically murdering immune individuals, to explore Elizabeth's natural recovery phenomenon despite its uncertain applicability, or to find some third option that none of them had yet considered in their desperate search for hope in a world that seemed determined to crush any possibility of redemption or renewal. The tension in the destroyed laboratory reached a breaking point when Marcus stepped forward with the quiet determination of a man who had spent 3 years making impossible decisions, his weathered face showing no fear as he looked Colonel Mills directly in the eyes and declared that there had to be another way forward that didn't require turning survivors into livestock for a cure that demanded innocent blood. Tommy shifted his position slightly, his military instincts reading the tactical situation and calculating their chances against Mills' superior numbers and firepower, while David clutched his notebook containing Elizabeth's research data like a lifeline that might hold the key to humanity's salvation without requiring them to sacrifice their souls in the process. Elizabeth herself stood with an otherworldly calm that unnerved both sides of the confrontation, her enhanced senses detecting subtle changes in heart rates and stress hormones that told her the situation was about to explode into violence. And when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that came from having died and returned with knowledge that none of the living could fully comprehend. She explained that her research in the dead zone had revealed patterns suggesting that the natural recovery phenomenon wasn't limited to specific geographic locations but was actually triggered by complex interactions between the infected individual's immune system, environmental factors, and psychological states that could potentially be replicated through careful scientific methodology rather than brutal harvesting of human tissue. Dr. Patterson looked up from his position behind the overturned table with the desperate hope of a man who had spent months being forced to participate in atrocities against his will, and he began to describe additional research he had hidden from Colonel Mills, experiments showing that synthetic alternatives to human-derived hormones could potentially trigger the same cognitive recovery process without requiring the torture and death of immune survivors. Colonel Mill's patience finally snapped when he realized that his carefully constructed operation was being threatened by what he dismissed as wishful thinking and naive moral posturing, and he barked orders to his soldiers to secure all the survivors for immediate processing while dismissing Elizabeth as a dangerous anomaly that needed to be eliminated before she could contaminate his serum production program with false hope. The firefight that erupted in the confined space of the laboratory was brutal and chaotic, with overturned equipment providing cover while Tommy's combat experience proved invaluable in coordinating their defense against professionally trained soldiers who had the advantage of superior numbers and positioning. Marcus found himself fighting not just for survival but for the very concept of humanity's moral future, understanding that how they resolved this conflict would determine whether civilization's second chance would be built on a foundation of murder and exploitation or on the possibility of redemption and scientific discovery guided by ethical principles. Elizabeth's unique abilities proved crucial as the battle raged, her zombie physiology allowing her to absorb damage that would have killed a normal human while her retained intelligence let her outmaneuver Mill's soldiers who were trained to fight either normal humans or mindless infected but had no experience dealing with someone who combined the best attributes of both. David surprised everyone by using his engineering knowledge to jury-rig an explosive device from laboratory chemicals and electronic components, creating a diversion that allowed them to break through the soldiers' containment attempt while Dr. Patterson crawled toward a hidden safe containing research data that could validate Elizabeth's theories about natural recovery mechanisms. The turning point came when Marcus and Tommy managed to corner Colonel Mills himself, and in the desperate negotiation that followed, the colonel revealed that his organization represented the remnants of a shadow government that had been planning for exactly this type of civilization-ending event, with protocols and resources designed to rebuild society according to their vision of necessary brutality and calculated sacrifice. Mills argued passionately that sentiment and moral considerations were luxuries that humanity could no longer afford, that the systematic harvesting of immune individuals was simply the price that had to be paid to restore the millions of infected to productive citizenship, and that their refusal to embrace this harsh reality was tantamount to condemning the human race to permanent extinction. Elizabeth's intervention in this philosophical battle proved decisive when she demonstrated her ability to communicate with and influence other infected individuals, calling forth a group of naturally recovered zombies who had been living peacefully in the surrounding area and showing Mills soldiers that there were alternatives to both the harvesting program and the continued existence of mindless, aggressive infected populations. The sight of intelligent, peaceful infected individuals working alongside immune survivors shattered many of the assumptions that had driven Mills' brutal methodology, and as his own soldiers began to question their orders, Marcus realized that they had achieved something far more valuable than a simple military victory. They had proven that humanity's second chance could be built on cooperation and scientific discovery rather than exploitation and fear. 6 months after the confrontation at Research Station Alpha 7, Marcus stood on the observation deck of New Haven Settlement and watched as the morning sun illuminated a community that embodied everything they had fought to achieve. A thriving town where immune survivors worked alongside naturally recovered infected individuals in a partnership that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of the plague. The settlement had grown from the handful of survivors who had gathered after Colonel Mills' defeat into a population of over 300 people, including 47 recovered infected who had been successfully treated using the combined methodologies that Dr. Patterson and Elizabeth Wright had developed together in their makeshift laboratory. Rebecca Martinez had become the settlement's chief medical officer, overseeing a clinic that provided care to both immune and infected residents while conducting ongoing research into the recovery process, and her daughter Emma had adapted to their new life with the remarkable resilience of youth, forming friendships with both human children and the younger recovered infected who were relearning how to be part of a community. Tommy Rodriguez commanded the settlement security force, a mixed unit of human and recovered infected individuals whose enhanced senses and retained combat skills made them remarkably effective at protecting their growing population from the remaining hostile infected and the occasional raids by less enlightened survivor groups who still viewed all infected as enemies to be destroyed. Dr. Patterson had found new purpose in his work developing synthetic alternatives to human-derived hormones, collaborating with Elizabeth and David Kim to create a treatment protocol that could trigger cognitive recovery without requiring the exploitation of immune individuals, and their success rate had improved dramatically as they refined their understanding of the complex biological and psychological factors involved in the recovery process. The settlement's greatest achievement, however, was demonstrated every few weeks when they conducted large-scale rescue operations that brought groups of infected individuals to the safety of the recovery zones they had established, areas where the combined effects of environmental factors, community support, and medical intervention created optimal conditions for cognitive restoration. Today's operation was their most ambitious yet, targeting a horde of nearly 200 infected that had been trapped in the ruins of a shopping mall 30 miles south of New Haven, and as Marcus watched the rescue teams prepare their equipment and vehicles, he felt a profound sense of pride in how far they had all come from the desperate survivors hiding in subway tunnels and fighting for scraps in a dying world. Elizabeth Wright led the advanced team, her unique ability to communicate with infected individuals allowing her to approach even the most aggressive zombies and begin the delicate process of establishing trust and reducing their stress levels to create conditions favorable for recovery, while Dr. Patterson's medical team followed with portable treatment equipment that could begin the serum therapy immediately once the infected showed signs of receptiveness to intervention. The operation unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance, with teams of humans and recovered infected working together to safely contain and transport the rescued individuals while maintaining the calm, non-threatening environment that was crucial for successful treatment outcomes. And by evening they had successfully brought back 43 infected people who showed immediate signs of cognitive improvement under the settlement's care protocols. As Marcus joined the welcome ceremony for the new arrivals, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the desperate hopes sparked by Dr. Patterson's original radio transmission to the moral crisis that had nearly destroyed their faith in humanity's capacity for ethical behavior, and finally to this new understanding that their second chance as a species lay not in choosing between competing solutions but in combining the best aspects of different approaches while maintaining their commitment to treating all sentient beings with dignity and respect. Rebecca approached him as the ceremony concluded, her arms sliding around his waist as they watched recovered infected individuals helping newly arrived patients navigate their first steps toward cognitive restoration, and she whispered that Emma had asked if they could adopt one of the recovered children whose parents hadn't survived the initial plague outbreak. The request encapsulated everything that New Haven represented, the possibility of building families and communities that transcended the artificial barriers between infected and immune, the willingness to take responsibility for those who needed help, and the confidence that they could create a future worthy of the sacrifices that had brought them to this point. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above their settlement, Marcus realized that humanity's second chance wasn't just about surviving the zombie plague or even reversing its effects, but about learning to build a civilization based on cooperation, scientific inquiry, and the fundamental recognition that their strength lay not in conquering their enemies but in transforming them into allies in the ongoing project of human renewal and hope.